How we doing, everybody? Welcome to Chapter 12. If you felt like you were in accounting class again, that's probably an appropriate feeling. You know, Chapter 12, broadly speaking, is a chapter that I'm glad is here, even though this isn't necessarily one of my areas of expertise. This chapter is making sure that marketers have that ROI mentality, particularly the sales function, which is in charge of revenue. In almost all B2B type scenarios, the firm does not have a revenue stream without the sales force. So that's kind of where this chapter is coming from. Making sure that if we are managing a sales force, that we have, I'm uncomfortable with the word control, because that's the word that they use here in Chapter 12, controlling costs, but monitoring costs, you know, taking into account of costs, making sure things are not just happening. And more than anything else, as we'll see in a couple of these questions here, you know, eliminating a division or a strategic business unit or a particular geographical area might not get rid of the profitability problem one might have. Okay? So broadly speaking, how does a company come to consensus about which cost methodology to use? Well, it's a function of a number of things. One last thing before I get into the questions. It's very common for lots of sales forces to have either one or two people from finance or accounting as part of the team, particularly in the analysis aspect of this. If you see, besides this being a familiar refresher from like an accounting mentality, we also have a familiar feeling of sort of like a ratio analysis kind of a thing that we've done a lot in finance. Okay? So how does the company come to consensus about which cost methodology to use? I think the easiest way to answer this question, and it leads into a couple other ones, is it depends about the complexity of the sales force and the complexity of the products/divisions the company has. Let's look at this question, and I'll help bleed these two together. What's the advantage for a small business to use contribution margin as opposed to full cost analysis? Well, some small businesses cannot use contribution analysis. I mean, if we look on page 419, the major advantage to using contribution analysis is if it is possible to break out costs per division, you know, or you want to call it a strategic business unit, or you want to call it a product line, or you want to call it a particular geographical area. But if you have the ability to get cost attributed to a particular, I like calling it a strategic business unit, well then guess what? You would use contribution margin because it gives you a more fine-grained feel for what's happening cost-wise. Now, full cost analysis is simpler. It's more straightforward. We have a very good... This is also on 419. You know, for firms that cannot separate the cost per division, per strategic business unit, they don't have any choice but to use full cost analysis. And for a small business, well, guess what? You really maybe only be able to do full cost analysis because you can't tease out any individual contributions from various product lines or divisions. So how does a company come to consensus? Well, it's a function of the company and how complex their operations. The more fine-tuned you can go, the more you would use contribution. Why is the return on assets managed less popular than either sales or cost analysis in managing the overall sales function? This comment it's on page 438, and it's also at the bottom of page, in the very last part of the summary. And it's also on 437. You know, to put a straightforward answer is you know, contribution margin and full costs are significantly easier to do than return on assets managed. You know, these are more widely accepted, these are more widely applied than return on assets managed. But the other issue with return on assets managed, if we look at the formula, I mean, talk about complexity. It's the last 5 pages of the chapter just to talk about it. The asset turnover rate, this can be challenging to calculate. Particularly with B2B, what exactly is turnover? Is turnover within the supply chain to final user, such as a consumer, but yet in order to get to that consumer, you had to go through a wholesaler and a retailer? Is that where the turnover gets calculated? Or in the case of, let's say Samsung, for instance, to them, turnover is a function of units shipped, not units sold. So units could be shipped but not sold, but to Samsung, they count it as sold. So Samsung, for instance, loves to have these wild press releases that says, we sold 2.3 million units of X, yet they shipped 2.5 million units of X to various wholesalers, distributors, and retailers, yet consumers only bought 500,000 copies of unit X, product X. So this asset turnover component to it is a little bit of a challenge, and also the amount of information needed to do return on assets managed. Let's put it this way. The larger the firm, the better the probability of return on assets managed, but usually within the sales force, we do one of the 2 other contribution or full cost analysis. All right, some additional questions here. On the bottom of page 418, there's a whole bunch of words here. Can judgments also be made about a function's profitability and performance by how it might affect larger fixed indirect costs? I'm going to agree with you here. And if we look at 419, the important component is just cutting an SBU or cutting a division or cutting a geographical area. That may look like on the balance sheet it will reduce a division that's not profitable. Therefore, okay, if that's the only division that's not profitable, then we should be fine. But if we see on the bottom of page 419, those, it could be, something as simple as, we're getting a certain price because we're selling X number of units through our supplier. But if we get rid of a division, all of a sudden, if we get rid of Department 1 or Division 1 or SBU 1, all of a sudden our volume discount is no longer there. And because the volume discount is gone, SBU or Department number 2, now that one's unprofitable, even though we got rid of unprofitable Division 1 or SBU 1. That's kind of what I think you're getting at here. On page 423 notes that whether a cost is treated as direct or indirect depends on the profitability's purpose. And on page 424, the text describes that decision maker chooses how to attribute the functional costs among different business segments. Does this make for a high level of subjectivity and profitability determination? And would this be a reason for the mentioned slower adoption of cost analysis by firms? Well, a sales manager in and of itself, he or she has a lot of things to do. If the sales manager has support from accounting or finance to help decide, I mean, even when we do, you guys remember your accounting class, there is some subjectivity in where you decide costs or, or even revenue streams get accounted for. You have some guidelines. Creative accounting, I'm sure one of your professors called it. As long as you did it within some rules and regulations, subjectivity, maybe variability in the way you can account for different things is a better way to look at this. I think the slower adaptation adoption of these things is just due to complexity. If some sales managers don't have the time just to do it. Does evaluation of different functionality, such as product or customer or territory or distribution channel, lead to an emphasis on different parts of the Rome formula within its further breakdown? As such, when evaluating profitability of a distribution channel, wouldn't that bring special emphasis on asset turnover component of the Rome? I think I kind of answered that earlier up in here when we were talking about that. I'm going to agree with you. I think you're heading in the right direction. And particularly if we're talking about the distribution channel, well then we're going to have more of an emphasis on the asset turnover component of the Rome formula. But there could be other components. Let's go back to what leads into the various percentages of sales. Sometimes what is counted as a sale is difficult, or even not what it is, when it is accounted for. Just a quick story. This crazy little thing, today is Apple's earnings call, right? All eyes are on Apple because this is somewhere between 53 and 50% of all of Apple's revenue. Well, Apple has this creative accounting thing that they do, that they get a certain subsidy from all the carriers, Verizon, AT&T, and such. And this subsidy occurs over a 2-year period, and it's per quarter. So let's just say Verizon's going to give Apple a $300 kicker for this phone. Well, that $300 is going to be divided between 8 quarters across 2 years. Now, Apple is allowed to do that because, the rules in accounting say that there's nothing against doing something like that. And they wanted to spread that revenue across multiple quarters. But if the sale of the phone is in a certain quarter, there has been some discussion that Apple could take all that $300 kicker and put it into one quarter if they really wanted to. And people are wondering why they're going across multiple quarters as opposed to the one quarter. But this gets into the Rome formula. The firm has to make a decision on how they want to account for revenue as well. So there's other things that you have to decide. And as long as the firm is consistent over time, then okay. See what I mean? Okay. If there are further questions for Chapter 12, shoot me an email. And I'm going to go work on Chapter 13.